Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon to you. I want to welcome everybody to the Douglas County Chamber's Greystone Community Impact Luncheon, sponsored by Connally, Jordan and Associates. My name is Craig Owens. I'm the president at Wellstar Douglas Hospital and the incoming 2020 Chamber of the Chamber Board. I'd like to first of all welcome Ken Bernard with Sherrod and Bernard to come forward and lead us in the invocation and pledge. Ken?
I don't want y'all to be shocked by me leading the invocation today. If you'd all stand and bow our heads, please. Let's close our eyes for about 10 seconds and just pause. Bless us, O Lord, for these thine gifts, for which we're about to receive from thy bounty. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Oh, I'm doing the pledge. I was in the Marine Corps. I promise you I know the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Kenny. First of all, I'd like to ask our Chamber Board members to please stand and introduce themselves. Chamber Board members.
Ken Bernard. Paul Zach. Howard Ray.
Kristen Douglas, West Georgia Technical College.
Gil Strauss, Water and Sewer Authority.
Tanya Jackson, Wayland. Nadia Fawcett, Graceville Power.
Thank you, board members. And we're also very proud of our 2020 Cornerstone members that used to be named Chairman's Club that joined us today. I'm sure many of you noted them on the slides that were being shown here in the beginning of the luncheon. I wanted to say thank you and recognize the group that's sitting up front with the signs. The Chamber would also like to introduce and welcome our newest 2020 Cornerstone member, Carl Peterson with Vibrant. Carl, can you come up and give us a few comments, please?
Hey, thank you very much. Hi, I'm Carl, and I'm really pleased to join with the Chamber as a new Cornerstone member. I'm here to introduce my company, Vibrant. But before I do that, before I introduce what we do, I think it's a little important to know who I am. So my favorite self-description is a passionately creative facilitator. So what that means is that whether I'm relating to someone, teaching someone, making something, or leading a group, I seek to help those around me accomplish their dreams, realize their dreams. That's what I was going for. Over the past 20 years, I've had the privilege to work with just numerous great organizations and people and equipping them to do greater things. So in that spirit, helping people do greater things, I started Vibrant. Through bridging the gap which exists between an organization's goals and the technical systems that they use to accomplish those goals, we've been able to deliver meaningful change to over 100 organizations across the country. Equipped with a really broad range of technical excellence or experience, we are well equipped to partner with organizations of all sizes in providing independent strategy, review, and solution implementation services. We're passionate about helping great people do greater things, and we look forward to journeying with you. Carl Peterson.
Thank you, Carl, and welcome. On behalf of the Chamber, we want to present you with this welcome gift to the Chairman's Circle and to our Chamber Leadership Group. So thank you so much. We appreciate you very much. Finally, will our Chamber diplomats please stand and be recognized as a group? Chamber diplomats, please stand. As many of you know, the Chamber diplomats are a group of 30 individuals who collectively represent the Chamber and the community at ribbon cuttings and events and many other ways behind the scenes. Now I'd like to invite our luncheon sponsor, Dennis Connolly, shareholder of Connally, Jordan & Associates, to come forward and say a few words. Dennis?
Number one, it's indeed a pleasure for us to be able to sponsor this starting out 2020 and all the 20s. I look around the room and a lot of you I see and welcome you, of course. I understand the last time Andrew didn't frighten you enough. So I'll guarantee you I will. You have on the table today a Coca-Cola. The reason being is I'm a graduate of Emory University, the Coca-Cola School. The only place that I know you could drink a Coca-Cola in class, out of class, or after class. They didn't care. So enjoy the Coke. Now, what I would like to just talk about for a few seconds, number one, we are a firm that's been in business since 1989. We have 11 people, and we got over 150 years of professional experience within our group, which I would like for them to stand at this moment, please. And you can recognize that we have ages that almost cover a century. Almost. What I want to report to you today is some excerpts from the Taxpayers Advocate report to Congress and the IRS. These are problems with tax refund delays in the taxpayer's service. During the 2019 filing season, the IRS, with a new Filter X, flagged 1.1 million tax returns, held up the refunds on those tax returns, and finally, out of that, 71% had no problems, and everybody finally got their refunds. That was a big problem last year. And also during the fiscal year, the IRS received 100 million telephone calls. They only answered 29%. This is what we deal with. While the percentage of the calls answered dropped from 49 to 29%, wait times increased from 24 minutes to 38 minutes. Well, that's a total lie, because I was on the phone 4 hours and 10 minutes, the last call I put through in December, after speaking to the third person who could partially resolve what I had called about. In addition to dealing with the IRS code, the regulations, we're now faced with dealing with tax cases. I can give you the names of the cases, but in these cases, they have indicated that a taxpayer not reading the entire 1040 form before they sign it constitutes extreme recklessness by the taxpayer. I know every one of you read every word that we put on a tax return in front of you. Second to recklessness for the taxpayers, if they do not research the educational and professional credentials of the tax professionals on whom they rely to prepare their tax returns, then they are considered also extremely reckless. And this comes into play when we are fighting to abate penalties for people. The question of, were you a reckless taxpayer? And you know what? This system is totally broken, and we have no choice but to work with it. But to encourage your congressman, please, to allocate more funds to the Internal Revenue Service so that they have enough people who can effectively handle this problem. I don't know how many have experience trying to dial and get on the phone with them, but it is ridiculous. And I also encourage you to work with well-qualified CPAs and tax preparer professionals. It is most important as we move forward. And the next thing is total security. Do not email anything with your Social Security number on it unless the entity you're mailing it to gives you a secure port to send it to. That will help some of this situation. We're all a little frightened about information leaks everywhere you go. So that's one thing in our office that we're ranting about. Do not let that happen. Do not let that happen, please. Past all of that, it is wonderful to be here as I approach my 81 years of age. Thanks again.
Thank you, Dennis. We appreciate Connally, Jordan, and Associates' support in making today's luncheon possible. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker. Thomas J. Cunningham is Senior Vice President and the Chief Economist for the Metro Atlanta Chamber. Tom joined the Metro Atlanta Chamber in July 2015 following a 30-year career at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. He's a specialist in open economy, macroeconomic policy, that's a mouthful, and regional analysis. At the MAC, he manages an internal team that supports the research and advocacy roles of the economic development and public policy departments. After starting his career at the Federal Reserve Bank as an economist in the macro policy group, Tom served at various times as Associate Director of Research, Interim Director of Research, Vice President for the regional group, where he was also responsible for the Latin American group, and acting head of the finance group. He served on the bank's personnel, information technology, and risk management committees, and as a member of the Federal Reserve System's Information Security Group and Technology Services Council. He was also the acting director of and helped establish the bank's Center for Real Estate Analytics. When Dr. Cunningham retired from the Fed, his title was Vice President, Senior Economist, and Regional Executive. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Tom Cunningham.
Hi. I'd describe myself as an economist. Thank you. What I'm going to do today, oh, hey, look, I can take this off. I can't take this off, I'm sorry. What I'm going to do today is talk about the economic outlook, talk about 30 minutes, talk about the risks associated with that, and then if we have time, do some questions, and if we don't, I'll be available afterwards to do Q&A on an individual basis. I started my career actually teaching. I taught at Columbia for a while. And one of the things you learn there very early on is that there's nothing better right after lunch than an economics lecture. So you can thank your program committee for that. I think they showed some wisdom in this. So let me start right away with kind of talking about what I'm going to try and do today and kind of the bottom line on this stuff. What I want to do is talk about the economic outlook for the metro area. And it turns out that isn't wildly different than the economic outlook for the United States overall. And that's because of the way Atlanta developed. That, back in the middle of last century, in the 1950s or so, the sort of socio-political debate was, what's going to be the leading city in the U.S. Southeast? Is it going to be Birmingham or Atlanta? Birmingham was a center of steel production in the U.S. Southeast, and Atlanta was the center of busy water production in the Southeast. The question is, who's going to dominate, And the answer is that the little red bottle on your table came out ahead. What really happened was that starting in the mid-'70s or so, Atlanta started to grow at a faster pace than the rest of the United States, and did so systematically and continues to do so systematically to this day. And so we've had basically half a century of growth in excess of the nation as a whole. And what that means arithmetically is that if you're going to add jobs at a faster pace than the nation overall, you're going to have to import people from the rest of the nation. And we've done that systematically, and as you import people from the rest of the nation, you start to look like the rest of the nation. So if you're going to look around at major cities in the US and try and identify a city or a metro economy that more closely resembles that of the United States, you're going to be hard-pressed to beat Atlanta. That Atlanta has arguably the most diverse economy of all cities in the US. At the Metro Chamber, that makes our life a little bit difficult because there isn't one thing that drives the metro economy. That is, if you go to Pittsburgh, it's education and healthcare. Well, that's an easy thing to get your head around if you're trying to sell an area. What Atlanta has is very good for business. That is, Atlanta has diversity and size. In fact, metro economy, but one of the things a lot of people that are in the metro area are not aware of is just how big we are. If we were an economy unto ourselves, we would be almost the size of Austria. So if you have Austrian friends, don't tell them that because they get mad. But we're really large, and we're really diverse. And in the trade, the term is thickness of diversity. And what thickness of diversity does is it minimizes risk for firms that are moving into the area. And my kind of favorite example is if you're moving into the area and you're an entrepreneur and you need some kind of idiosyncratic intellectual property lawyer of some kind, you're going to find 6 of them here in Atlanta. If you're that same entrepreneur and you're moving to Nashville and you need that same kind of weird lawyer, you're going to find 6 of them here in Atlanta. That's the advantage of being here, that as you start up a firm, you're going to make mistakes and you're going to need help, in some cases very idiosyncratic help, to get the mistakes fixed. And they're within driving distance here. The Metro Atlanta Chamber is kind of not really a chamber of commerce in some sense. We do economic development and public policy work. So about half, we always have someone abroad working on international business development. And about 1/3 of the projects that we land throughout the entire Metro Chamber apparatus come from abroad. And a large reason for that is because foreign firms recognize that if you're going to establish a foothold or a presence in the United States or in North America, it's not just that you can get to Atlanta really easily, which is an advantage to be sure, but once you get here, there's support locally that you're just not going to get in most other cities. And it's that kind of risk minimization that's associated with the size and diversity of the economy that really makes Atlanta work well. It's also a virtuous circle that as you get firms that move in, because this is a low-risk place to do business, then there are more firms. And so it becomes a still lower-risk place to do business going forward. So it's a virtuous process circle that keeps on going. From my vantage point, the nice thing about having a large, diverse economy is that the outlook for the Metro Atlanta region looks very close to that of the overall U.S. economy. And that's something you can all take home with you, that as you think about what the risks are for the local economy, they're pretty much the same as the risks for the national economy. It's true that we're going to be performing better than the national economy. There's going to be a gap. We're going to outperform the rest of the nation. But in terms of what would slow us up or slow us down or speed us up, those risks are identical to the nation. So when you hear, kind of analysts talking about whatever the latest data release is, you can apply that pretty much directly to what's going on in Atlanta, just again remembering to adjust for the fact that we're doing a little bit better. Okay, so what's the outlook for the U.S.? And the simple answer there is things look okay. That's a wildly enthusiastic statement, I know, but it's true. We're in the midst of the longest expansion we've ever had in the U.S. And one of the things that has done is it sparked a lot of commentary in some media outlets about the notion that because we have been without a recession for so long, we are due for a recession coming up. Well, this is the longest expansion we've ever had. The expansion in the aughts was fairly long by historical standards. The second longest expansion was in the 90s. The profession went back and really rethought or re-examined how business cycles actually work in the U.S. And I think it's fair to say that the consensus conclusion of that is that expansions don't die of old age, that something has to kill them. That is, that if you are in a growth path that seems sustainable over a long period of time, you're not doing anything really nutty, and growing at a reasonable, sustainable pace, that's what it means to be growing at a reasonable, sustainable pace. You don't have to have a recession. I mean, in a formal sense, if you're a math nerd, if you're trying to predict the probability of recession, it has nothing to do with the length of the expansion. The length of expansion just doesn't influence the probability of a recession coming up. Something's got to kill the expansion to get it go. And as a good example of this, actually, is Australia. Australia hasn't had a recession for 30 years. That they missed the Great Recession completely. They had a little bit of a slowdown because everybody they were trading with was in recession, but there's a notable difference between seeing growth slow somewhat and us actually being in recession, actually moving backwards. And we're in a position where growth is sustainable, but nothing to really write home about. I think we're going to see growth this coming year of about 2%, which is not bad. It's not what it was the last couple of years, but it's important to kind of think about where growth actually comes from in the U.S. And this actually is going to be really important when I wrap this back to the metro area again. When you think about growth, you get it in one of two ways. You either add more people, add workers to the economy, or you make the people that are working more productive. So if you take employment growth rate plus productivity growth rate, that is the growth of the economy that's under question. Right now, growth is 1.5% or so, and Chris over here is responsible for some of that. But what's really changed over the last couple of decades is the rate at which our employment base is changing, and that's a demographic function. That what has happened in the post-war period, we typically saw growth around 4%, and that basically came from employment growth of 2.25%, 2.5%, and then productivity growth of something a little bit under 2%. And that gives you the 4% long-term growth rate. That's fine. Right now, the U.S. employment base, the U.S. workforce growth, is about 0.8%. That we have whacked about 1.5 percentage points off of the rate at which employment is growing. And that really is an odd feature here, that what's going on is not that we're not seeing new workers come in to the labor force in the way we traditionally do. What we're really seeing are the baby boomers aging out of the labor force. And so, we've gone from a 2.25% labor force growth rate to something on the order of 0.75%. You're going to be very hard pressed in that environment to see growth beyond 2 to 2.5% over a sustainable period of time. And we have been enjoying that for a while. I think we're going to slow down a little bit this coming year, but not a whole lot. One more kind of disturbing thing about the demographics, that economics is known as the dismal science. And so I can't let you go without a little dark cloud over your head. So here's one of many that will be coming up. What's really going on here is, again, not that we're not seeing people come into the labor market, it's we're seeing a lot of people going out of the labor market. People that are going out have a lot of human capital, that they are highly experienced people. They're the people that have been around for a long time, that know what's going on, all that. We've never seen an exodus of human capital from the economy like we're seeing right now. And in fact, nobody has. The only economy that has seen something like that is Japan. Japan's baby boom actually happened right after World War II. Ours was delayed by about a decade. And boy, didn't work out real well for them. That does not mean necessarily that there's gloom and doom ahead because we're losing all our highly skilled workers. But it is the case that we only have one observation. You don't want to generalize too much out of that, but that one observation wasn't very good. So there is some reason to kind of be concerned here and to see kind of 2% growth as not too bad a number to see as a sustainable thing going forward. Okay. So what about the risks to that 2% growth? The first place we got to look is personal consumption spending. That in the U.S., consumption spending is about 70% of the whole economy. That's more than any other economy functionally on the planet. That's not necessarily a bad thing. The reason we work is in order to be able to consume. That we realize that you can't just consume everything that you make. You've got to invest in bridges and schools and all kinds of stuff. But if you're in a relatively wealthy, relatively advanced economy, the idea that you would have a high share of output devoted to consumption is a pretty reasonable idea. That's, again, the point of working. It does mean, however, that if consumers get scared, particularly about their future income streams, and pull back, you're going to have a recession. And that's kind of the story of recession. It's also why it makes recessions really hard to forecast. That in general, what has happened in the U.S. is there's always been some kind of shock that has kind of disturbed the economy. And in fact, in the post-war period, they're almost all oil shocks. That in 2007, it was an oil shock combined with subprime mortgage mispricing. In 2001, it was an oil shock combined with the dot-com bubble. In 1979, it was an oil shock all by itself. In 1974, it was an oil shock all by itself. But the point is that there's something that happens out there in the economy. And then people get worried about their income stream, and if they're worried about a recession, they cut back on spending right now, and so you get a recession right now. So if I were to credibly tell you somehow that we were going to have a recession 6 months from now, we'd get a recession right now. And that's what makes recession particularly hard to forecast. But the way recessions then work is that once the fear of income streams go away and consumption kind of comes back, it tends to come back fairly strongly. The recessions don't touch most people. That unemployment goes up, but most people keep their jobs. And so in general, what happens in the U.S. is when recessions end, you get this burst of consumption, that all the stuff that wasn't consumed that caused the recession gets consumed when people feel better about their income stream. And so you see this feature in the U.S. that if you have a deep recession, you have a really sharp recovery. And if you have a shallow recession, you have a shallow recovery. Well, this last recession, we had a really deep recession. We didn't have a particularly great recovery. The macroeconomic term for a recovery is crappy. that we had a really crappy recovery. I don't mean to throw jargon around. But what we were seeing is consumption growing about in line with income. And what was going on is that consumers that had worked hard to get their balance sheets in order didn't go out and spend a bunch of money and see their balance sheets go back to where they were pre-recession. That made for an unexciting recovery, but it also made for pretty solid consumer balance sheets, that people did not go on spending sprees. And if you look at aggregate numbers for the US, and to be sure there are pockets of weakness everywhere, but in an aggregate sense, debt to income in the US on a personal level are near record lows. More importantly, debt service to income is essentially at record lows, largely because of low interest rates. So consumers' balance sheets are in really pretty solid shape. So in terms of having to be forced to cut stuff in the event of fear, it's going to take a lot bigger shock now to put us in recession than has been the case in the past. More importantly still, though, is the labor market. And I'll spend a few minutes talking about that near the end of this stuff. Labor market is really solid now. At an aggregate level, the headline unemployment rate's 3.5%. We just haven't seen that before. We're functionally at full employment. What that means in functional terms is that if you are concerned about your job and worried about having to get another one, the probability of getting another one is now higher than it's ever been. That labor markets are genuinely tight. And so again, it's one of those situations where the shock that's going to have to occur to put us in recession, it's going to have to be bigger than what's happened in the past. And you look around, shocks by their nature are unexpected, but it's a little hard to identify where stuff is. We certainly had a problem with trade. But that's been a year and a half ago. It is clear that was extremely disruptive, and it's been disruptive to investment and to ag, but it wasn't enough to derail the overall economy. We still could have some surprises there. We're going into an election year, so all kinds of nutty stuff could happen. But in general, you look around and kind of say, what is it that's going to derail things? It's a little hard to see. And the whole key there is about whether or not you're actually going to disrupt patterns of consumption. Another thing to look at is investment. On the investment side, we want to divvy it up between real estate and everything else. Real estate's largely recovered. We're at a point where there are certainly some areas in the country where demand for real estate is not particularly high or growing, but in general, the issues associated with the real estate disruptions associated with the recession have worked themselves out. That's kind of over. Not that we're seeing any kind of grand things. In fact, if anything, single-family housing has been a little light compared to historical standards and compared to household formation. But in terms of real estate being something that would really kick us into a recession, that's a little hard to see. Things look pretty solid there. On the business investment side, the kind of plant equipment, intellectual property stuff, investment's actually been a little light. And that has been disturbing, that we had a tax reform act that kind of revisited corporate income taxes and did some helpful things there. And we thought we'd get a kick in investment as a result, and we really didn't. That investment's up a little bit. But if you think about the fundamentals that would drive business investment right now, we have a real problem with labor, that we're in pretty short supply there. We have extremely low interest rates, and we have fairly healthy overall demand. All of that would suggest that investment should be pretty strong, and it hasn't been. So what do? Well, we go out and ask companies why they're not investing the way the models say they should be. And the answer pretty uniformly is trade policy. That particularly for big dollar investments, for large manufacturing facilities or something like that, global trade is integrated and supply chains are integrated. And if you don't know what the supply chain is going to look like 6 months from now, building a billion-dollar manufacturing facility just doesn't make a lot of sense. That you could easily get the supply chain assumptions wrong, and that would be very costly. And so I think what we see here is actually a real upside risk. And it's odd to use the term risk associated with upside, but that's what it is. There's a lot of upside potential here that in a fundamental sense we should be seeing really pretty decent business fixed investment. It's not happening, largely because of policy uncertainty. And the whole trick to the policy uncertainty is that you know that it will not last. That we're in a transitory period. Supply chain uncertainty isn't going to be the rule for the rest of eternity. It's a transitory thing. Waiting to pull the trigger on big dollar investments makes a lot of sense when you know that the real risks associated with those investments aren't going to be around in a foreseeable period of time. I mean, if they get resolved tomorrow, that would be great. That's pretty unlikely. But there's an awful lot of pent-up demand there on the investment side that I think poses, in terms of getting the forecast wrong in a pleasant way, there's some real risk there on the upside. Third thing to look at is government. In terms of government, state and local government's about 60% of government's direct involvement in the economy. That state and local governments consume goods and services. The federal government collects a lot more money, but then it spends it in transfer payments that show up someplace else in the economy, and they don't do all that much direct consumption of goods and services. State and local governments are in pretty good shape. Not that they are brimming with money and blah, 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 but in terms of state and local governments facing an unexpected forced set of layoffs, that's pretty unlikely. Early in this recession, that was not the situation that we were facing. That one feature of state and local government is that property taxes in particular have about a 3-year lag between changes in property values and the ultimate change in the property tax rolls. And so early in this expansion, while the private sector was doing pretty well, state and local government was still laying off teachers because they just weren't seeing the revenue come in the way that was before. Well, that's not on the table right now. The probabilities of disruption there are pretty low. At the federal level, I have no idea what to tell you. Yeah, thank you. Good night. We have a very large deficit, and that's unfortunate. It's not something that is not manageable right now, but it's pretty clear that it can't go on forever. My favorite economist, unfortunately, is dead now. Actually, a lot of my favorite economists are dead now. A guy named Herb Stein used to say, "That which cannot go on forever will stop." Okay, that's wise, and that's kind of where we are with this. That right now, Treasury's managing the marketing of the debt really easily. There's no problem. But it's not going to have, that can't go on forever. We're running $1 trillion deficits. We are either going to stop because we have thought carefully about how we want to get off this path and we get off it in a thoughtful, meaningful way, or we get off the path because we hit a wall. Those are kind of the options here. And I hope that we choose one option rather than the other, but I don't really have any answers here. If I did, I wouldn't be here. I'd be someplace else. Portugal, for example. Yeah. So at the federal level, there is a looming problem, but it's not kind of an emergency at the moment. The final thing to mention is trade. And trade actually looks pretty encouraging. That particularly if you think about the kind of west side of the metro area. The U.S. has about 5% of the world's consumers. The Eurozone has a little bit more than that. So 85% of the world's consumers are in emerging economies. And emerging economies are where you're seeing income grow relatively rapidly, in part because they're coming off a relatively low base. What happens when a society's income goes up is its consumption shifts. And its consumption shifts towards higher value-added stuff, okay? Well, we are really good at making higher value-added stuff. That the U.S. Southeast in particular gave up making low value-added stuff a few decades ago, and it was a pretty painful process that we saw an awful lot of like textiles and stuff like that, cut and sew assembly plants leave. And it was a painful process of adjustment. And what substituted for that were autos and jets and data centers. Those are high value-added products, and that is what the rest of the world's consumption is moving towards. So, you know, it's possible that we could disengage from the rest of the world in terms of trade and miss the boat entirely on this, because Europe would be happy to fill the void. But the fact is that the rest of the world's consumption is shifting towards what we're already good at doing. And that's something that, looking beyond the current disruption in trade, is a very kind of exciting thing for trade outlook, particularly for the U.S. Southeast. Not going to happen overnight. It's not going to be this sudden, wonderful thing. But in a secular sense, we are moving towards having a much larger market for our goods. I mean, if you were at the Eggs and Issues breakfast this morning, one of my favorite anecdotes was repeated by Senator Perdue, who said, look, you know, the U.S. has about 150 million middle-class consumers. China has about 400 million middle-class consumers that they are striving to consume with the people of here we already accommodate. And, with appropriate access to that market, we could do really quite well. Okay, so that's the real side. I'm going to spend a couple of seconds talking about the labor market and then shut up. First Friday of every month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics releases the employment report. My wife is also an economist, so our kids are really screwed up. First Friday of every month at 8:30, we used to gather around the breakfast table, waiting for the employment report to come out and wondering, rooting for that jobs number and that unemployment number. The two numbers that get attention are the number of jobs created and the unemployment rate. There actually isn't one unemployment rate. The headline unemployment rate that everybody pays attention to, 3.5% right now, is called U3. There are actually 6 numbers that come out in that press release. The broadest of those 6 is called U6, imaginative group. And that group, the difference between U3 and U6, contain people that are working part-time but don't want to be working part-time. They're called part-time for economic reason employees. With a 3.5% headline unemployment rate, we would think we would see a lot more wage pressure than we're seeing right now. I mean, wage growth is, 3.5% or so, and that's pretty nice. But with 3.5% unemployment, you would kind of be in a hair-on-fire labor market situation and expect a lot faster job gain. But that isn't the case. And I think what's going on is it's this gap between U3 and U6, that you have these part-time workers that want to work full-time. And what that means is that if an employer offers more hours at prevailing wages, this segment of the labor force is willing to provide the work. You don't have to offer higher wages to get people into the labor force that weren't there before. And until the gap between these two measures closes back to kind of where it's been traditionally, I think even though we look like we're at full employment, we're not going to see the kind of wage growth that we'd normally see with, again, kind of a hair-on-fire labor market. The final thing to say is the number of jobs produced numbers. You get 150,000 jobs produced this month. That's true. And actually, the Bureau of Labor Statistics does a very good job of calculating that, and it's surprisingly accurate. But it doesn't capture the dynamism of the U.S. labor market. And I think that's important to think about as kind of we leave here. every month, in an average month in the U.S., you got about 6 million people that get a job that didn't have one before. And you got about 6 million people that leave a job, either voluntarily or involuntarily. And it's the difference between those two numbers that is that 150,000 jobs a month that got created. But what's really going on is a really dynamic churn in the labor market. That you got about 12 million people that are changing their employment status, either in or out of employment in any month. That's incredible. And it's really important for the resilience of the U.S. economy that as you kind of reassign workers, they're getting reassigned to a better purpose. And either geographically or across industries or within industries, across jobs, blah, blah, blah. There's a resilience there that's really important. That's also really critical for Atlanta. That if you didn't see that kind of churn, Atlanta would be in real trouble. That the reason we are able to attract the in-migration that we've kind of lived on for the last 50 years is precisely because there is this churn out in the rest of the economy. If you are a happily employed lawyer in Cleveland, even though Cleveland, not all that great, but if you're happily employed and have no concerns, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to get up and move just idiosyncratically to Atlanta. On the other hand, if you're part of this churn and you have to think hard about where employment prospects are actually the most attractive, Atlanta comes out pretty attractive in that list. And so it's that dynamic churn, that dynamism in the U.S. labor market that's really critical for both the U.S. well-being and Atlanta's as well. Okay, so we're out of time. I'll do questions after this thing's over if you guys want to talk, or if you don't, that's fine too. The one thing I will close with is a plea. Go buy stuff. Okay? Thanks.
Well, thank you, Tom, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. As a thank you for speaking, a contribution we made in your name to the Chamber Board Scholarship Fund, which funds a scholarship for graduating high school students each year. All right, now we have our raffle drawing, correct? Would you like to come up? Oh, Dennis, come on back up. Oh, and by the way, Dennis, we figured out how to solve, we were doing some back of the envelope calculations here, and we figured out how to solve the baby boomer retiring crisis. You just need to work till you're 105. So we'll be good to go. The first winner is a gift card to Gabe's for $50. All right. The last 4 digits, 7117. The next winner, ticket number, well, Fabiano's $50 gift certificate. Ticket number 7134. 7134. Bingo. Last winner, $50 certificate to the Blue Rose Art Bistro. And the winner is 7136. 7136. Yeah.
Well, we're not going to give up on the Coca-Colas. On the table today are flower arrangements that were produced by our client, 2000 AD in Hapeville, Georgia. And on the table, there's one bottle that has a sticker on the bottom of it. That person who has it takes the flower arrangement with them.
A lot of excitement over that. Few announcements, just a couple of announcements before you go. The 2020 Chamber Winter Ball presented by Wellstar Douglas Hospital will be held Saturday, February 8th at the Douglasville Conference Center. We need your help. Our silent auction funds the programming, and we need items for the silent auction. Your donation can be a gift certificate, home goods, a night on the town, a weekend in the mountains, lunch with Ken Bernard, or a stay at your favorite resort. Please contact Carly at the Chamber to donate an auction item. You're invited to step up your networking game at our Next Level Networking program on Wednesday, January 22nd at 7:30 a.m. at West Georgia Technical College. Share about yourself and your business during multiple activities and enjoy a complimentary breakfast. Register attend no later than Friday, January 17th, and see Sandy for additional details. Thanks again, Dr. Tom Cunningham, for that informative speech today, that informative information, and to Connally, Jordan and Associates for sponsoring today's luncheon, and to Greystone Power for their naming sponsorship. Have a great rest of your day.